my parents divorced early when I was 7 years old or so, and so when I would often bounce from place to place, you know, whether it was with sitters or friends or family or whatever. And you know, there was an episode with a babysitter when I was 8 of sexual abuse, and then later that summer, tragically, at the hands of a male. So the first time was with a female who was a caretaker of mine, and then later in the summer, a male, which was a much more physical, aggressive type of encounter. And both of those things kind of worked independently of each other, but at the same time, for me, was you know, they were also very akin. And you know, what happens in that moment is that you're stunted. Your growth is stunted in that moment. Like, it, in reflection now I understand it, but in the moment you don't really understand it. You just go about your life trying to keep people at arm's distance and build up barriers so that you don't have to be who you're authentically called to be, because you're afraid of that. You're afraid of being vulnerable. You don't really know how to do that well. You don't trust anybody. You're always looking for the next tragedy around the corner. And so what had happened to me in that moment was that, you know, I ceased to grow as a human being, really. Not physically, of course, but emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And so I never learned how to do relationship very well, not even when I got married.
You know, I think the lie that people who've suffered abuse believe is that they're the only one.
Yeah,
it's
right.
a huge number. Have you experienced that now that you've talked about it?
Yes, I have. You know, I think the last stat that I saw was 1 in 6 males. And like you said, those are only and for a male, it seems to be a little bit different. The willingness to share it. You know, because we're brought up in this bravado culture of a man needs to be a man, and you know, what that may say about your manhood, or what you think that may say, is something that plays with your mind. It certainly did with mine. You know, like I thought that if I ever let that out, you know, out into the open, that I would be viewed as, you know, a very weak and very cowardly person, and that's another reason. More evidence that that growth is stunted. It's actually the opposite. I mean, men that are able to talk about their abuse as a step towards healing are actually the ones that are the most courageous. You know, and that's the trick the enemy perpetrates, is that, you know, if you tell another soul, you know, it's going to be awful. People are going to throw their hands up and run the other way, and so that lie is perpetrated by the enemy in a way that really makes it hard for you to be vulnerable and transparent. It took just me coming to the end of myself before I ever confessed myself about what had happened.
I agree. I think it's an incredibly brave move, and an even braver move, I think, too, is that, like, abuse was done to you, but then you talked about your mistakes, you know, cheating on your wife and the cost to your marriage. How do you repair from that? And is it possible to repair from that?
Yes, I think God is in the business of redemption. I mean, thankfully. And so, yes, I absolutely do think that there is a better side, you know, to all of it. And I do think that there is, you know, God does build beauty from ashes in so many different ways. And I've seen that firsthand in my own life so vividly that I would, you know, profess that from the mountaintops. But for me, it was very difficult because, you know, with my wife, I had no idea how to do relationship. You know, I didn't have it modeled for me at home. I was getting my education from magazines or TV or media, or I didn't really have a way to know what was appropriate, what wasn't, outside of my moral compass, which was skewed anyway from growing up not really having a center. I didn't become a Christian until I was 13 years old. And even then, I didn't have much refinement. It was almost like I came to know Christ, and then I was on my own to try to figure it out from there. And so my real success story for me has been, first and foremost, a much more deeply cultivated relationship with a living God.
Well, you know, a lot of people are struggling in their marriages, and different reasons for that. But what is the best piece of marriage advice you would give to people?
For me, it's just, regardless of the risk, to be honest. I always thought that if I told Ann really who I was, that she wouldn't want anything to do with me, and I was madly in love with her, and I didn't want to think that she could, be anywhere else but beside me. So I never was authentically honest about who I was, about what I had experienced in my past, what that had done to me, the things that I had done. And so it was a big risk for me to talk to her about that. And regardless of the infidelity or my past or the abuse or whatever other hell I had put her through, she looked at me and said, I'm not going anywhere, I love you. And that did more for my transformation as a human being and probably a believer as any other experience in my life.
She sounds like an incredible woman.
She is.
All of what was happening in your personal life, at the same time, you're dealing with crazy things happening in your professional life. Your baseball career has been up and down, the majors, the minors, the majors, the minors. How did that kind of play into some of the things you were already feeling about yourself?
Well, when I started going into counseling, I met a guy who is now probably my very best friend, and his name's Stephen. And Stephen and I developed a relationship where I was finally enabled and are empowered to live authentically in the moment. I learned what it was like to be present. I learned what it was like to invest in every moment. I learned what it was like to suck the marrow out of every experience. And so because of that, I felt like I was a much better pitcher. My knuckleball started to really improve. I was more engaged in the games that I was pitching in. I had this capacity and this hunger to learn, and I was energized and motivated to come to the field and discover things. And a lot of that, most of that, maybe all of that, the genesis of that was learning what it was like to live in the present and understand that there is only right now, and that I'm not my past nor my performance on the field, but that I'm created in the image of a loving God, and there's my worth is not what has happened to me. My worth is not my performance. It's something so much more deep. And I learned that, and that took a lot of pressure off of everything else, and it really freed me up to be who I felt like I was called to be as a pitcher, and that was a knuckleball pitcher who was okay throwing a pitch that was very unique and that made me different.
When I read your story, one of the things that fascinated me, the turning points in your life, was when you tried to swim across the Missouri River, and that relationship between you having control of your life and realizing that you don't have control of your life. Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, the event itself, like I tried to traverse the Missouri in Omaha in the minor leagues, and the Missouri's a very strong current to it, and I almost drowned. And to make a very long story shorter, there was this point at the end where I thought I was gonna die, like I'd surrendered to it. I was like, this is it. And I started praying and apologizing and asking God to take care of my family, literally as I was sinking to the river floor. And at that time, my feet hit the bottom, the riverbed. And I was able to kind of harness enough adrenaline to catapult myself up to the top and take another breath and kind of bounce my way until there was a teammate of mine who had gone alongside the riverbank with me. I had gone, nearly a half mile down, and he had followed me. And I reached out, took his hand, and was able to live to tell the story. But it was a real kind of, it was a real metaphor, if you will, for my life in general, about surrendering, completely surrendering to who God wanted me to be, regardless of the outcome. Like, how can I not hold my career like this, but like this, So I went into the river. My record was 1-8. I had a high 5 ERA, and I was on the border of being released. And then when I emerged from the river, from the rest of the season, I ended up being like, 10-1, and became the PCL Pitcher of the Year. And that was really the springboard for me for the next year and the subsequent years thereafter. But just that idea of really letting go and letting God kind of take the reins, that was a big event for me.
Well, you talked about taking risks, and you and I have actually taken a very similar risk. We both climbed Kilimanjaro. Not only did we both do it, but the same week. And you actually summited the day before me, which is crazy, and for the same cause.
Yeah.
So we were both climbing for sexually trafficked women and kids. So why was that an issue on your heart?
Well, I think that's just something that's very specific to my narrative. People who are taken advantage of sexually speaks to my heart. And I got a relationship going with a man at our church who had a connection in India, and I heard the plight of this organization called the Bombay Teen Challenge, and prayed about it and felt obligated almost to get involved. And I've been involved with that ministry since 2011, basically, and it's been very rewarding. I've taken my daughters to India to be able to see not necessarily just the debauchery, but the healing. So where these girls are rescued too, and their redemption and their stories of restoration, they've got to participate in it even. And so it's been a great thing for not only me, but my family.
Who do you think you would be if you hadn't walked through some of those dark chapters in your history?
Well, I think the better thing for me is to think about where would I be or who would I be if I hadn't had help in confronting some of the things that happened in the darker parts of my life. I was a breath away from committing suicide in 2008. I was in my car. I had run a garden hose from the tailpipe of my car into the driver's side window and stuffed a towel in the crack, and I was a moment away from turning the key because I had had enough. I'd had enough of the pain, and I had had enough of all of that. And right before I was about to turn the key, I heard, have you had these moments in your life where you feel like you audibly hear God? They're not every day maybe, but there are times when it's Him. And there was a time right before I hit that key where I felt like God said, don't do it, I have something else for you. And in that moment, the next day I went to counseling. And that was like the moment, the end of myself, where I came to the end of myself. And I had to be brought to that place. God had brought me to my knees. And I had tried to do it on my own enough. And he had had enough. And it was a time when it was time for surrender, and that surrender is what gave me my life back.